He said, 40 years later, do you have a different perspective? So as I began to talk in the front row, a young student, she began to giggle, to laugh. And I asked her, why are you laughing? She says, he's still alive? Well, I'm not sure. I'm even not sure whether I am in Peru. Am I in Peru? Because I was in Peru in 1998, 11 years ago, and I come to Lima again, and I see a very different country. It has the same name, and it's a different country. How could that be? And as you know, a country which has the growth experience of recent years, democratization, stability, tranquility, these are the conditions essential for budgeting and managing for results. It would be unthinkable in Peru to have the agenda for today without the growth, without the stability, without the democracy. These are the fundamental underlying conditions which bring us together now, okay, which make it possible to even dream about managing and budgeting for results, which is the topic that I want to talk about. I also want to emphasize that while I do not recognize the new Peru compared to when I was here 11 years ago, I recognize elements of the old Peru. If you go only through Lima, you drive through different parts of the city, the different districts, you discover a much greater gap than 11 years ago between the rich and the poor. And my purpose in mentioning that is not to advise you on social programs, but to tell you budgeting and managing for results is about development, the effectiveness of development. And development effectiveness means uplifting the poor. For those who have, the market sector handles most of their needs, not government. The market sector is a vast, effective, the most efficient engine ever developed for production and distribution of goods and services. For those who can afford them, the role of government is much more limited. They will develop by themselves almost regardless of government. But for those who, to take the title of the famous book by Hernando de Soto, those who take el otro sendero, those who take the other road, the road of the squatters, the road of the makeshift buses, the roads of the small shops, those of you who remember reading this, one of the most famous works in development, El Otro Sendero by Hernando de Soto. Development must focus on them. And managing and budgeting for results, therefore, cannot simply take aggregate data. What is total growth? What is total participation or attendance in universities? How many physicians are we producing, et cetera? How many kilometers of roads have we constructed? These aggregate data are critical. But in managing and budgeting for results, it is essential to think about those who are much more dependent on government and to disaggregate the data so that they differentiate between those who rely principally on the market sector and those who must rely more on the public sector. Okay. With those words of introduction, I'm very pleased to be here with you in Peru and to tell you that the article in 1966 arose out of my PhD dissertation a few years earlier, which is about budgeting for results. So how could it be almost a half a century later, we are talking about the same topic as if it is brand new, as if it is just yesterday and today that we have discovered it? And the answer is, budgeting for results is a very simple idea and a very difficult idea to implement. You have an exceedingly difficult task to do. Having said this, I believe fundamentally that particularly in countries like Peru, it is at the subnational level that the path of budgeting for results is much clearer. Precisely because, as Mario Marcel said, there's a much closer connection between the citizen and government, between the services which are provided and the recipients of those services. You can see a much clearer connection between budget and allocation and program decisions of government on the one hand, and the recipient and the effects of the services on the other hand. Put yourself in the position of the national government, which distributes resources to subnational governments, which in turn run and operate the various programs and activities. From the perspective of the central government, it is much more difficult to move ahead on budgeting and managing for results than it is on the subnational level. So it will not surprise me that if Peru, like other countries, the subnational levels are the pioneers, and they make much greater progress than is possible at the national level. Okay. Now, there's a reason why I was asked to talk about budgeting for results. But instead I said, as you see on the title, I will talk about managing and budgeting for results. Because the theme that I want to emphasize in this session is that you cannot budget for results unless you transform public management. That is the single idea I hope that you come away with this session. It is a fundamentally different an idea than when I wrote my PhD dissertation 50 years ago. 50 years ago, the concept was budgeting drives management. Budgeting is so critical. Budgeting controls resources. You can leverage the budget process so that you can transform government. Looking back at 50 years of failure, we know that was a mistake. Budgeting is part of a family of management practices. If you don't manage for results, you won't budget for results. Now, having said this, I've made the task for each of you far more difficult because you cannot carve out and isolate the budget process, cram it full of interesting data, as Mario Marcel suggested, and say, voila, we have budgeting for results. The agenda that you face is to transform public management. And that's very difficult in countries which have a tradition of clientelism, which have an embedded civil service, we have many rigidities in public management. But I can tell you, and I don't want to discourage you right at the start, that if you do not change the way you manage the public sector in Peru, you will not change the way you allocate and spend resources in Peru either. Okay, so let's, this is the theme of the first slide I have, okay, that budgeting is one of the core processes of public management, and you cannot distinguish between the way governments manage and the way governments budget. And fundamentally, if budgeting focuses on compliance and control, it will not focus on results. What I'm telling you now is as follows. Budgeting and managing for results is not simply a matter of addition. It is not a matter of introducing new processes and new information. It is more important to subtract than to add, to take away things that you are doing, to take away part of the regime of control. Every one of you will go back to your offices next week after a couple of days of this seminar. And every one of you will face rules and controls and compliance and rigidity which will dominate your day. Whether it's about procurement or about travel or about supply or about accommodation or most frequently about personnel and human resources. Okay? You have those rigidities and you manage to comply rather than manage for results. I'm holding in my hands right now a Bible.